Hello and welcome to the Energetic Psyche, Season 3, Episode 5, When Brain Health Becomes an Act of Care for Ourselves and the World. I'm Dr. Adrian Campbell and I'm really glad you're here. In Episode 4, we talked about burnout and compassion fatigue and how those might be showing up for people who have never really had exposure to those terms before. I shared the 5 tools of mindful resilience based on the work of Veterans Yoga Project and led a 30-minute practice using those tools. In this episode, I want to take it one step further and bring us into the biology, specifically the neurobiology, and one of my favorite parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, because of course I have a favorite part of the brain. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a neuroscience lesson, I promise, but we are going to talk a bit about what it is, how it works, why it's important, and what you can do to support that part of your brain so you can keep showing up and creating the change that you want to see in this beautiful world of ours. So what does the prefrontal cortex do? Well, the prefrontal cortex is actually one of the newer parts of the brain, at least from an evolutionary perspective. This part of the brain doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. Some research even says early 30s, and its evolutionary newness is one of the reasons it gets exhausted more quickly than others. When we overwork the prefrontal cortex, it doesn't just get tired, it essentially goes offline as the brain shifts control to other, more primitive systems. And that matters because the prefrontal cortex is responsible for some pretty important things. This part of the brain handles decision-making, impulse control, emotional regulation, attention, and focus. It supports empathy and perspective, being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, as well as moral reasoning and judgment that's grounded in your personal values and beliefs. When the prefrontal cortex is functioning well, we're able to pause, reflect, and choose how we respond. But when it becomes exhausted, the consequences can be significant. Instead of responding intentionally, we begin to move into reactivity or even shutdown. The prefrontal cortex is also what allows us to stay regulated while remaining engaged with complex, emotionally charged information, which frankly makes it especially relevant right now, given the state of the world and everything that's unfolding. One of the biggest contributors to prefrontal cortex exhaustion is chronic stress. As I've talked about recently, many people are dealing with levels of stress they've never had to navigate before. And even for those of us who are familiar with high-stress environments, all of this is being layered on top of what was already there. For a lot of people in the United States, especially right now, baseline stress levels are simply higher than normal. And because stress is cumulative, this has real consequences for the prefrontal cortex. Some of the most common stressors include lack of sleep, which takes away the time the brain needs to rest and rejuvenate, constant decision-making. Even small or seemingly insignificant choices add up. Emotional overload, including repeated activation, frustration, or distress. Ongoing uncertainty, not knowing what's coming next or how things are going to resolve. Continuous exposure to distressing information, especially through news and social media. Each of these on its own can be manageable, but layered together over time, they can create significant impact. Remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So we need to be able to support ourselves for a long-term sustainable effort. When this part of the brain is overworked or undersupported, several things start to happen. It becomes harder to think clearly and regulate your emotions. Tolerating ambiguity, basically not knowing what's going on or what's coming, becomes a lot more difficult. Patience and compassion are harder to access, which is one of the ways that compassion fatigue and burnout begin to show up. And our decision-making suffers. A simple example is coming home after a long day, especially one full of meetings, conversation, interaction with others, and then being asked, what do you want for dinner? Suddenly, you can't make one more decision. Even if you normally care about eating well or supporting your body, your brain is done, and you'll eat whatever is given to you as long as you don't have to decide. And that, my friend, is decision fatigue, a classic sign of an overloaded prefrontal cortex. It's important to remember that if you're experiencing any of this, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means that you're human and your brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do under stress. We only have so much capacity for high-level, complex functioning. When the capacity is exceeded, the brain shifts priorities to focus on our basic survival needs, And this is where the nervous system comes in. When we either consciously or unconsciously perceive threat, whether physical, emotional, or social, the brain automatically shifts resources away from the prefrontal cortex toward the limbic and brainstem-based survival systems. This isn't a choice we make. It happens unconsciously. This shift is often described as activation of the fight or flight response. You may also have heard it referred to as an amygdala hijack, which simply means that the brain temporarily prioritizes survival and emotional processing over rational and reflective thinking. In this state, the prefrontal cortex is overridden by the older and simpler limbic and brain-based systems designed for survival. This makes impulsive or reactive responses a lot more likely. Again, this happens automatically. It's not a conscious decision that we make. It's the nervous system doing its best to protect us from perceived danger. In true emergencies, this is exactly what we want. If your life is in danger, you don't want to sit back and thoughtfully analyze the situation. You want to move, react, survive. The problem is that this isn't the kind of threat most of us are dealing with right now. Instead, we're facing ongoing, often abstract threats like existential dread, social division, and constant uncertainty. Terrible things are happening in the United States right now. Trust feels fractured. People are unsure who is safe, who is not, and what's coming next. Law enforcement, communities, and individuals are all struggling to navigate complex moral and social terrain. This type of stress is not what the nervous system was designed for. When threat doesn't seem to let up and keeps coming at us through our screens all day long, the nervous system stays activated. Over time, people start to feel like they're losing access to the parts of themselves that normally help them stay grounded, thoughtful, and regulated. Unless we can find a way to disconnect and rest, the prefrontal cortex will struggle to come back online. And at that point, we're no longer moving between stress and recovery. We're stuck in survival mode. And that's where burnout begins to take hold. So what can you do about it? Well, in addition to the tools I shared in the last episode, there are two very simple and extremely effective ways to support the prefrontal cortex. The first is to reduce unnecessary or unconscious threat in your environment. And the second is to shift the way you do things so that more of your life runs on habits, reducing your overall decision load and creating a higher level of certainty and predictability in your day-to-day life. Keep in mind that most of our day-to-day stress isn't dramatic. I'm not talking about the truly serious things that are happening in our country right now. I'm talking about the background stress, the ambient stuff that quietly accumulates over time. Things like traffic, the route you take to work, wearing uncomfortable clothes, lack of certainty around your daily schedule, dealing with annoying coworkers, screaming children, sick pets. All of this adds up. Yes, we sometimes experience one big event here or there, but for most of us, daily stress builds little by little. The good news is that because the prefrontal cortex is sensitive to that cumulative load, even with small changes, we can make a meaningful difference. For example, taking a different route to work. Now, some people make fun of me for this, but I don't care. I intentionally take country back roads or neighborhood streets instead of multi-lane roads or highways whenever I can. It's calmer, it's quieter, and if I'm lucky, I get to see cows or other animals along the way, which genuinely makes me happier. It might take me a bit longer, but as long as I plan for it, it's not an issue. That kind of choice does two things at once. It reduces stress and adds something positive. It supports the nervous system instead of taxing it. Now, the second support strategy is all about creating habits. Habits are one of the most effective ways to protect the prefrontal cortex because they reduce the number of decisions you have to make in a day. When I teach leadership courses and talk about prefrontal cortex health, this comes up a lot. If you look at many highly effective leaders, you'll notice that they often have very consistent routines, especially in the morning, and that's not accidental. It reduces decision fatigue so the prefrontal cortex can focus on things that actually matter. Spending 10 minutes debating whether you want a bagel or a burrito, a latte or a black coffee may not seem like much, but all of those choices add up. By mid-afternoon, the brain can feel completely done. Something as simple as meal planning can make a huge difference here. You don't have to prep everything in advance or spend an entire Sunday cooking if that's not your thing, but even just taking a few moments to lay out, this is what I'm going to have on Monday. This is what I'm having on Tuesday, means that you start mornings out fresh, and when you come home from work, you're not burning cognitive energy on yet another decision. It's already been handled. Sleep is another non-negotiable when it comes to supporting the prefrontal cortex, which is why being serious about sleep hygiene and building consistent wind-down routine is so important. These habits signal to the brain and body that it's time to rest. What does this look like? Well, it's different for everyone, but for me, I actually have an alarm set on my phone for 2 hours before bed. When it goes off, I turn off any screens and I take a few minutes to tidy up the kitchen, the living room, fill up the dog's water bowl. Nothing too intense, just enough to create a calm, settled environment. Then I make a cup of sleepy time tea and I read until I'm tired enough to fall asleep. I also try to use my e-reader or a physical book rather than my phone, so I'm not tempted to drift off into scrolling on social media. When I do this every night, my brain and nervous system come to expect it. It creates a sense of consistency and predictability, which helps me relax. This supports my nervous system, and it makes it easier to transition into sleep. It's a simple routine, but it works because it's habitual, calming, and supportive. It requires no decisions and creates certainty and predictability, exactly what the prefrontal cortex needs, especially right before bed. The goal here isn't to hack your brain or optimize yourself into exhaustion. It's to build a supportive relationship with your body and nervous system. By creating predictability, structure, and habits where you can, and by reducing unnecessary stress where possible, you help keep the prefrontal cortex online. And when that part of the brain is supported, you're better able to think clearly, feel deeply, and act with intention in ways that align with what actually matters to you. So what can you actually do with all this information? Well, I'd recommend taking a few moments to think through a typical day and notice where stress shows up consciously. Think about the moments where you can actually feel yourself getting tense, irritated, rushed, or overwhelmed. And then ask yourself, what is something small that I could shift or change in those moments? I gave one example earlier of changing the way I drive. I intentionally take quieter routes, neighborhood streets or back roads, instead of busier multi-lane roads. It's calmer, more peaceful, and it lowers my stress before I even arrive where I'm going. Another example is how I handle communication. There's often an unspoken pressure to respond immediately to texts or calls. That constant interruption is really stressful for me. So when I need focused time, I keep my phone on Do Not Disturb. And that one small boundary significantly reduces my stress throughout the day. Now, you don't need to overhaul your whole life. The goal is to find one small change, a decision you can make once that reduces stress many times over. I'd also encourage you to look at where you might be able to create habits that reduce your overall decision-making load. This is often simpler than it sounds, but it is worth it, especially if you create habits that are sustainable for the long term. For example, a simple way to support brain health in the morning is to create a morning routine if you don't already have one. Take the time up front to lay out your needs on paper and then create an order for them to be accomplished and follow that same order every morning. For example, wake up, do 30 minutes of yoga meditation, brush teeth, wash face, make coffee, eat breakfast, get dressed, head to work. These small changes support your brain, your nervous system, and your overall stress load by reducing fatigue and increasing feelings of certainty and predictability, just like the nighttime routine. Now, if you want some support figuring out how to put these concepts in place, this is something hiring a coach can be really helpful for. It's one of the first things I do with all of my clients. We identify their unconscious stress and we do our best to get rid of it. Now, with any new habit, remember that it usually takes a few weeks, roughly 21 to 30 days, for any habit to feel established. So you really have to stick with it to see the benefits. But it is worth it because a healthy prefrontal cortex and rested nervous system help you stay connected to the version of yourself that you want to show up as. Clear, grounded, and able to engage with your life in a way that reflects what matters to you most. If things feel harder than they used to, if you're noticing you're more reactive, more tired, less patient, or struggling to focus, it doesn't mean you're failing. It likely just means your system is overwhelmed. Remember that caring for yourself, taking time to tend to your brain and nervous system, isn't selfish. It's how you remain capable of care, clarity, and meaningful action over time. Thank you so much for joining me. Wishing you safety, certainty, and predictability. If this podcast resonates with you, please be sure to subscribe so you can be notified of future episodes. I look forward to connecting in the future.